that they had looked at all of the evidence in the trial and that they didn't need to re-watch it again and re-look at it all again because they hadn't made a decision. And he believes that decision will be guilty. But again, we have to be very careful. It is the 12 people, the 12 jurors that were chosen that makes that decision. And we're going to hear that decision very shortly. All right, Sarah Seidner, thanks so much. We'll come back to you in a moment. Let's go now to a different part of Minneapolis. Adrian Broadus is in a different part, I think downtown, near a police precinct. Tell us what's happening where you are.
Hey there, Jake. We're about a half mile from the Hennepin County Government Center. If you look behind me, you'll notice a crew with the city is installing more concrete barriers just in front of the roadway that leads to the police department. On the other side of that truck, there's a gate. That gate wasn't there earlier today. It was delivered and installed moments before we learned jurors had reached a verdict. On the other side of the police department, the businesses here, Lola Red, have put up more boards to protect their building. When this verdict, the news came that the verdict was reached, we were inside of a church at 38th in Chicago. If you sit down inside of the sanctuary, that church, and look out the window, you can see George Floyd Square. You see where Floyd took the final moments of his life. We shared with the pastor that we were speaking with for another story. The jury has reached a verdict. He and his wife said their heart dropped, but they found a bit of comfort knowing the jury reached the verdict so quickly. And one thing they also pointed out, so many have asked them, what do you think the outcome will be? He said they're not necessarily worried about the outcome. The bigger question at this hour is what is most important. And they talked about humanity. He talked about the people he served for nearly 40 years on that corner. Like Floyd, he moved to Minneapolis from Texas. And like other people in that community, he had issues with members of law enforcement at a young age. He said he had an encounter with police that left him with a traumatic brain injury. And he wants to use that experience, once we hear the verdict, to move forward, to help people heal. He said, you know, yesterday when we heard the closing arguments, the defense said Floyd had an enlarged heart. The prosecution said Chauvin's heart wasn't big enough. He said heart is at the center of this, and he leads with love. Downtown, around all of the barriers and barricades, there's a big billboard. It's black, and in white letters, there's the word love. And that's what he wants to lead with, love. Jake?
Adrian Broadus, thanks so much. I want to go back to CNN's Don Lemon. And Don, one of the most remarkable things about this trial and about the George Floyd case, and I don't know if my team has those murals, the pictures of those murals ready, but there have been pictures, paintings, murals of George Floyd around the world, in Pakistan, in England, all over, as a symbol of injustice at the hands of the government. This case has taken on a truly international meaning, representing the idea of people who do not deserve it being put down, being killed, being oppressed by their governments, often because of racism, but also just in general, government versus people.
Yeah, and it all started in Minneapolis in what is now George Floyd Square. There was no George Floyd Square there, obviously, before this happened. But it has also transformed in many ways to a Black Lives Matter way, which is in D.C., where you live, Jake. But I think the reason it's become such a symbol is obviously because, number one, I really do think that it's because of the attention that this particular case got because we were in quarantine. And because people didn't know where their lives were going, what was going to happen next, because we didn't know if our loved ones were going to be sick, and or if we were going to be sick, or what was going to happen from moment to moment, if we were going to have a job or so on. We have to remember where we were a year ago, and not very far, along in a year from now, a couple months, at May 25th. We're basically sort of in the same place. So we were all sitting at home in quarantine. And I think the whole world was watching because because the world looks to America as a symbol of democracy. And if there's any place on earth that can guarantee freedom and that can guarantee what the Constitution says, that we are in search of a more perfect union, there's no other place on earth than the United States. And to see this atrocity happen on a city street in the middle of the day in the United States was just something that people could not wrap their heads around it worldwide. People in America couldn't as well. For people of color particularly, it was a confirmation of all those things that people say, well, you know, maybe it's an exaggeration and what have you, but it was confirmation. I think for many people around the world, it was just they were just stunned, and they couldn't believe something like that was happening in the United States and not in some war zone or some third world country.
So just to take a step back, the Black Lives Matter movement, as I recall first hearing about it, was in 2015 after the death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And if we go back, not even 6 full years, and I don't mean to pick on Hillary Clinton, but Hillary Clinton, who certainly is somebody who is allied with civil rights, first asked about this, did not know what Black Lives Matter meant, made the same mistake that a lot of politicians did at that time, saying, oh, well, all lives matter. Now we're at a point, almost 6 years later, after all of these different cases, and maybe crescendoing with the death of George Floyd, that because of the pandemic, as you note, but also because of how horrifying this video was, this 9 minutes and 29 seconds of a police officer with his knee on the neck of George Floyd, while children begged the policeman to get off his neck, and he didn't. To the point that you have Mitt Romney marching with the Black Lives Matter movement in Washington, D.C. in 2020. It is a sea change in the culture, a sea change. Do you agree?
Well, I think it's a sea change in awareness, not necessarily in practice. And so we will see what happens with this verdict. But it was not just Black Lives Matter, right? And because many people didn't see, and it's so easy to see if you just added the word to, T-O-O at the end, or also, Black Lives Matter also, or Black Lives Matter too. And then I think it helps people understand what you mean by that. Not that all lives, don't matter,
right,
but Black Lives Matter because that's what we're talking about.
Right. At
this point, it's obvious that other lives, that it's obvious that white lives matter. But it wasn't just Black Lives Matter. Remember, it was Colin Kaepernick who took a knee for injustice, police injustice, and for reform in this country. And then you had Derek Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck. At first, what we thought for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And now, when the trial started, we learned that it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds.
Right. And
so there have been a number of things that have led us to this. Remember, there was very fine people on both sides, and people said, okay, this is nuts. Then there was Ahmaud Arbery, and we can't forget how horrific that video is. Horrific what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, but how horrific the video is of Ahmaud Arbery jogging down a street and then being shot with a shotgun, and we see it.
Yeah.
And then we hear what happens to Breonna Taylor in her bedroom, and then the death of George Floyd. So there have been a number of things that have led to this, but yes, a sea change in awareness. We'll see if it's in practice when this verdict is read.
Don, we'll come back to you in a sec. CNN's Omar Jimenez is at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis at the site of this alleged crime. Omar, what's it like there?
Jake, well, a crowd has started to grow here, of course, in anticipation of a verdict, as you hear people start to chant as well. But when you make your way over to the spot where George Floyd took some of his final breaths, you see that, of course, the memorial aspect of this is still here. But then when you pan up and look over to the left, you see how many people have started to form. Some of them, of course, press here in this moment. But people are anxious. They want the results in this trial. They want the verdict. One woman we spoke to, who actually seems to be leading some of the chants right now, said that it doesn't matter to her what the verdict is. She feels that the momentum that has grown from the movement over the course of a little under a year now is enough to propel people forward for generations to come. And when you look over here, these are people, they're leading the chants. We're not aware that there's any television or something set up for them to watch to see actually when the verdict drops, but you see the passion is still here. They are leading. They want to prosecute the police. And one person we spoke to actually earlier today said that's what they do here in Minneapolis. There was never a question. They wanted the police, I should say, to be treated how any other person would be treated if they had done the actions that Derek Chauvin had done. And so that's what people are feeling here. And when you think about this moment that we're in, this moment that has been coming for almost a year now, that has been building up, this is why it's important. This reminds you of the somberness and the reality of the situation, that a human life was lost at the hands of police, that a family still has a gaping hole. The only question is with this verdict, does this now become a spark point for even further to come out of here in Minneapolis, Jake?
All right, Omar Jimenez, and it's all in the hands of the jury right now. We're expecting them to come and to the courtroom, to the government center, and announce their unanimous decision after only 10 hours. We're all riveted, waiting to hear what they have to say. We understand that President Biden at the White House is at his TV, watching, waiting to find out what the verdict will be. Let's bring in Anderson Cooper and his panel. Anderson?
Jake, thank you very much. Appreciate it. When the jury does come, and we're not sure if they've been, do you believe that they've been sequestered at the hotel and that's where they came up with the verdict?
For those of you just joining us for our live coverage, 5 p.m. Eastern, is that the judge in this case, Judge Cahill in Minneapolis, has revealed that the jurors have reached a verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with 3 charges, as we know, in the death of George Floyd. We will learn from the jury momentarily. He said in about an hour. That would have been about 30 minutes ago, but we do know that they were sequestered in a hotel in Minneapolis. You have to factor in the idea that they would be brought and there's high security in this case to the Hennepin County courtroom, several floors up in that office building in downtown Minneapolis, where we have seen the fencing and the significant presence of the National Guard, though luckily, and we have not seen any reason for that security up until this point. And of course, everyone waiting to hear what the jury has decided in this case. I want to bring in Deborah Roberts. ABC's Deborah Roberts, a mom first and foremost, and a veteran correspondent here. But Deborah, you were telling us that it's a conversation that you had in your family with your children just in the last 24 hours about how the country, how the world might react to this.
That's right, David. And I'd have to tell you, when you all alluded to the videotape, as Steve Osunsami talked about, that was so much clearer and so much more impactful this time. Yesterday, watching those closing arguments and seeing so much of that excruciating videotape just sort of, I think, took us all back to last summer when this case just struck everybody. And if you have blood running through your veins, there's just no way you weren't impacted by that videotape. And just hearing those cries of George Floyd calling for his mother. I mean, there was something that was so primal and so difficult about that. And I did interviews last year with moms talking about how that affected them. And of course, of so many of us having conversations, as Terry said, with our children. And I had a conversation with my own 18-year-old son about it. And I have to tell you, it was emotional for me hearing him talk about how fearful he was after seeing something like that. And even right now, he can't even look at it. He turns away from this tape, seeing this man's final minutes on this earth. So I think there's something about that tape that just struck at everyone. And I think while we all know that, you know, you can't predict a jury and there are going to be people, as Terry said, who may feel like the jury got it wrong, there just seems to be sort of this united feeling in this country that there was something so terribly wrong that went on last year. And I think that people are just waiting. I mean, someone just posted on social media, I'm sick to my stomach waiting for this verdict. I think for so many people, this is the culmination of just an awful event that we have had to witness as people, with our children, as parents. And it has been something that has been very, very difficult. And I think that the weight of this verdict is sort of in play right here for so many of us who are dealing with this as parents, as well as just people who are watching what's going to happen. So you can't, I think, overstate the anxiety and the nervousness that people are feeling as they're waiting to see this come to a conclusion.
And Deborah, we of course have to remember that there is another family watching all of this all over again, and that's the family of George Floyd. And Deborah, I'm curious, you know, a year later, with the context of all of the reporting now, you know, that 9-minute video spoke volumes just by what we saw in the video, but given the context of the reporting and then what we've watched, because there was a live stream of the trial. So the country, the world watching, both sides make their cases, and with that additional context and with the very emotional testimony of those bystanders. I mean, we met just about everybody standing on that sidewalk just by watching this trial, and you have to wonder, and we'll learn which way the jury decides here in just a short time from now, but you have to wonder the impact of playing that video in the courtroom, not just for the family of George Floyd. It must have been excruciating to go through this all over again, but in those closing arguments, the decision by the prosecution, they went much shorter with the video than they did in the opening statement. On the flip side, the defense used quite a bit of the video with George Floyd on the ground, and I'll be curious to see what jurors decide from watching that video. In many ways, it was more difficult the second time around. And Judge Cahill now in the courtroom. Deborah, stand by. Our entire team standing by.
All rise for the jury. Please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts? So say you one, so say you all.
Yes. Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. Be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
Your Honor, the state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further?
All
right. Thank you.
So there you have it. The jury in Hennepin County in Minneapolis finding Derek Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Guilty in all 3. You can see him being led away there in the courtroom. He had been out on bail. You heard the state request of the judge that bail be revoked and that he be taken into custody, which is exactly what the judge decided to do. You can see the counts up on your screen right now. The jury deliberating yesterday afternoon and then began deliberating again early this morning, but it was a short period of time before we learned that they had come to a unanimous conclusion. Clearly, they thought that the case made by the prosecution and perhaps that final closing argument, that rebuttal from Jerry Blackwell when he said to the jury, it's as simple as what that 9-year-old girl, one of the bystanders, said that she heard the paramedics say when they arrived there more than 9 minutes after that knee was put to George Floyd's neck. She said that she heard paramedics say, get off of him. Of course, in the hours and the days to come, we will learn more from that jury, what they were thinking over the course of this 3-week trial. But we want to look at the reaction coming in from Minneapolis. This was the scene in South Minneapolis just moments ago. They had described the sound of the people gathering there, obviously erupting. Embracing one another, and in many ways for that community and for the people who have gathered there, it has been an extraordinarily long year in this country. This was the scene again, George Floyd Square. This is reaction from the families. George Floyd's family, with their legal team, Ben Crump, we know, leading that team, clearly overjoyed. They believe justice has been served in this case. Derek Chauvin found guilty on all counts. And I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, as we look at these images. Clearly, the pause there is in between each count as the judge was reading from that piece of paper delivered to him by the foreperson of the jury. And Dan, guilty on all counts. They believe the prosecution made its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yep, on each and every charge. And remember that there are slightly different theories with regard to second-degree murder and third-degree murder. I mean, there was a possibility that he could be found guilty of second-degree murder, not of third-degree murder, and then guilty of second-degree manslaughter. That didn't happen. This was a prosecution clean sweep here. And now Derek Chauvin will be sentenced on the highest charge, which is second-degree murder. Faces up to 40 years. The sentencing guidelines in Michigan suggest more likely 10 to 15 years. But I'll tell you, David, you mentioned that 9-year-old girl, and she could be relevant in the context of sentencing because prosecutors can ask for what's called an enhancement in the sentencing, meaning to go beyond what the guidelines would suggest because a child was present. And so that 9-year-old girl was not just an emotional witness, but she could become a very important witness with regard to the potential sentence that Derek Chauvin gets. You heard him, the judge, then referring to the Blakely standard, and that means basically start preparing for the argument over sentencing. And that will be the next phase of this case to determine what the sentence for Derek Chauvin will be. But at this point, certainly a big win for the prosecution in this case, getting everything that they asked this jury for.
Just to drill down on that point, Dan, as per Minnesota state law, the jury will decide, the judge will decide sentencing on the highest of the charges, which of course is unintentional second-degree murder. The presumed sentence is usually 10 to 15 years, but he faces up to 40 years. And as you mentioned, the state will ask for what's called an aggravated sentence here, and he could face decades behind bars.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think that is going to be, you know, really the next big debate in this case over exactly what should be the sentence for Derek Chauvin. Again, you know, as we talked about when the jury reached its verdict and we said they came back so quickly, this is not good news for Derek Chauvin. Again, on the sentencing side, I wouldn't want to be Derek Chauvin either, meaning that, you know, typically, and it's not just typically, it's really the vast majority of cases where you're talking about second-degree murder or third-degree murder, you are talking about up to 15 years. But in this case, based on a number of factors, I expect the prosecution to ask for more time, and the judge will have to determine that. And David, I want to just add one other quick point, which is about the diversity of this jury. And I think it's important because we often talk about diversity and it sounds like a concept as opposed to something that can actually instill a sense of confidence in people about a verdict. The fact that there were 4 people who were African American on that jury. There were 2 who described themselves as multiracial, 6 whites, and they all came together and very quickly agreed on this verdict. This was a jury of peers, and as a result, I think that that's helpful in instilling confidence in the verdict for the community at large.
And Sonny Hostin, as we look at these images coming in from across the country, but first, of course, from Minneapolis, relief in that community. And you yourself said, as a former prosecutor yourself, when you heard that there was a verdict and this quickly, that even you had thought there would be at least questions from perhaps the jurors for the judge, and there was not. Unanimous, guilty on all charges.
Yeah. You know, David, I've been a lawyer for 27 years, and I remember when I was in law school during my first year, the Rodney King verdict came out, and it was an acquittal for 4 officers who, on video, beat and stomped and tased a man, beat a man 56 times with a baton. And I believed my eyes then. So I believed my eyes this time with George Floyd. And even though I knew that fast verdicts always hint at an agreement, even though all of my training told me that they likely convicted on at least the highest count or at least the lowest count, because of the history in this country, because it is so rare that police officers are convicted, because black men and black boys are killed by police with impunity in this country, and that is just the truth, at a rate 5 times more than their white counterparts. Because I am the mother of an 18-year-old boy who is now in South Africa, and I feel that he is safer in South Africa than he is in his own country. I am so relieved that this is what justice finally looks like for my community. And while I know that this does not bring George Floyd back to his family, to his loved ones, to his brother who we've heard from so eloquently, at least I believe now that the movement that we've seen since his murder on video for the world to see is not just a moment. I really believe that this is a movement that we've seen. And for that, I am so very thankful that perhaps we will see real change, much needed change in this country.
Sonny Hostin with some very personal reflections on our coverage this afternoon and the guilty verdict from the jury in Minneapolis. Sonny, thank you. And when you couple what Sonny said and her observations along with what Dan Abrams said just moments before her, that perhaps this could be a unifying moment when you think about the jury and the diversity, the makeup of that jury. 6 white jurors, 6 people of color, 4 black jurors, and 2 who self-identify as multiracial, but they all deliberated together and in just a short period of time were united on what they saw when they watched those 9 minutes and what they heard over the course of 3 weeks inside that Minneapolis courtroom. You can see they have begun to put up signs in Minneapolis. That's the scene from South Minneapolis. Justice served is what that sign says underneath George Floyd's name now. They've now put that up on the sign, and my colleague Lindsay Davis is in Minneapolis. And Lindsay, the reaction there.
David, you know, there was a novel by Terry McMillan, subsequently a movie called Waiting to Exhale. Today it was so much more than that. That was All of Us. And just a little while ago, I was telling you about how the streets here were empty. You virtually saw, you hardly saw any people or cars. Well, suddenly now you hear just this celebratory honking. I saw a small group of black people walk by who chanted Black Lives Matter. And certainly, you know, this verdict doesn't change our criminal justice system, but perhaps for some, at least for this day, if nothing more beyond that, it does send this message. And for those who consider this to be a win or a victory, perhaps they owe a debt to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who shot that video, because so much was made of the prosecution's saying, but for the knee, right? And I imagine many today are saying, but for the videotape, would we find ourselves in this place today? After all, if we go back to how this started, all with a counterfeit $20 bill, a crime that Chief Arredondo testified that normally they wouldn't even take somebody into custody for. So much jubilation really on the streets here.
Lindsay Davis on the ground in Minneapolis for us as we continue our live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He was a veteran with the police force there in Minneapolis, a 19-year veteran, 45 years old. He's been found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. We're getting some color from inside that courtroom, and of course the live stream offers the country and the world a perspective that we would not have seen had we not been in this pandemic. The judge saying he was doing this live stream because the community would not be allowed to come into the courtroom and witness this trial as it unfolded. But some of what we can't see in that courtroom has just come in, and this is from the print reporter who was inside the courtroom. They're allowing a reporter or two inside that courtroom every day, but because of restrictions, just a small number of reporters. They described the scene as the judge said, "All rise." The jurors entering that courtroom, we are told all of them looked serious. None of them looked emotional, or that they had been teary, or that there had been, you know, emotions exchanged while they were deliberating. All of them, in this note that we've been given by the print reporter who was in the room, serious as they walked into the courtroom. Judge Cahill reading the verdicts on that paper as Chauvin stared at the empty witness podium. And as you saw at home, as we were carrying this live, you know, this is the era that we're in, the face mask. There was very little reaction unless you're reading the eyes of Derek Chauvin. And I do believe we have video of the actual moment. You won't be able to see much, but here's what we saw.
Permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1,